As a former Defence Minister, this news from Andrew today, the Office of a Special Investigator, is going to be headed up by the AG Department Chief Chris Moratis. Do you welcome that appointment?
Well, I certainly welcome, Kieran, the appointment of the Special Investigator. I don't know the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department. I'm sure he's a good man. I think what is more important is the extent to which he has power. And so I eagerly await that detail, of course.
Indeed. And one of the key elements of this is the meritorious unit citation. It's been a big focus of discussion this week. As a former Defence Minister, you know that there's a lot of anguish about this, certainly among the rank and file there, and troops that I've spoken to have expressed their disdain at the initial response from the CDF. Would you like this dealt with sooner rather than later to give people certainty on this matter?
No, I don't, Kieran. There is absolutely no rush in dealing with these matters with respect to honours, awards and medals. The biggest problem our Special Forces community has now is the way the government has handled this thing up until now. Linda Reynolds, the minister's comments about cold-blooded murder, of course, did not help. You know, they sent General Campbell out there to take all the heat on the day the Brereton report was released. The Prime Minister nor the Minister were nowhere to be seen, leaving everyone hanging on the government's intentions. And here we are, it must be a month on now, and all we've had is the appointment or the near appointment of the Special Investigator. I think the most important role for the government now is to protect the reputation of the regiment, both the Special Air Service Regiment and, of course, the 2 Commando Regiment. A lot of people are hurting out there because they're all being tarred with the same brush. Of course, those who have found in the end to have been guilty of unlawful conduct will by necessity pay a very, very heavy price. But the government should have spent the last month making sure the reputation of soldiers more generally haven't been adversely affected. And of course, not to take meaningful action against those who might be found of being guilty of unlawful conduct would be a dagger in the heart of those very, very courageous soldiers who came forward and blew the whistle on wrongdoing.
So do you think it was a mistake for the CDF to adopt one of the Brereton recommendations immediately at his news conference responding, where he said he would strip that unit citation for the Special Operations Command?
Yes, Kieran, there should have been more guidance from the Prime Minister on the day. So Special Forces soldiers, past and present, and indeed sadly deceased, and their families weren't left hanging on this question. There is no rush to make final decisions on medals, nor is there a rush to make final decisions, for example, on squadrons. There is plenty of time here, and the area of collective medals, that is unit citations, is a very grey one indeed. Most Special Forces soldiers, past and present, I speak with, can see the merits in both sides of that argument. So let's take a pause, take some time to consider it properly, rather than rushing to accept the recommendation.
You made reference to Linda Reynolds and her comments about accusations, the allegations of cold-blooded murder. She would argue that she was simply being upfront about what the allegations are. Do you believe she was too close to prejudging the accused, essentially?
No matter what the context, Kieran, I know that she did say these were the accusations. A minister using those words can be very, very hurtful to our soldiers, past and present, certainly very hurtful to their families, their loved ones, and she should never have used them. Now, we do have a principle of innocent until proven guilty in this country, but these comments were basically prejudicial, in my view, to those who are under a cloud, those who have been accused of these terrible acts. So she's got to be far more careful than that. Her primary responsibilities now here, of course, are to protect the reputation of us as a nation, to protect the reputation of the Australian Defence Force, but to make sure in this era of terrible suicide rates that our veterans and our serving personnel don't come under any more pressure than is necessary because of her ill-considered comments.
You, along with Phil Thompson, a veteran himself from the Liberal side of politics, the member for Herbert, have set up this parliamentary friendship group on medals and military citations. I go back to that question I asked you before about that unit citation. Wouldn't it be better at least to have a judgment on that so that the parents of fallen diggers and so on know that they'll be able to keep it?
Now, I think the families of fallen diggers would much prefer the time taken to properly consider this very difficult question. Look, there are three groups here, really. There are those who have individual medals for individual acts of bravery and courage, who absolutely have done no wrong. There is no cloud over their medals. There are those who have individual medals who do have a cloud over their heads, and they will probably sadly lose their medals. But there's a third group of people who have unit citations, that is, citations for the acts of the unit as a whole, that is, everyone in the unit. And of course, in that unit will be those who have done wrong, potentially, and those who not only have not done wrong, but didn't even know wrong was being done. Now, those who, and some of them, Special Forces soldiers previously, think that you can't have a meritorious unit citation hold if the unit itself wasn't meritorious because of the actions of some. Others say those who didn't know what was happening should not lose their medals. And I'm not pretending that's an easy question to answer, and that's why we should take a pause and take a deep breath and take some time to properly think this through.
Now, given you've said it was a mistake, that initial declaration on the day, you say there should be time. There wasn't on that judgment. Do you believe that Angus Campbell should remain in the job of Chief of Defence?
I think in the interest of the reputation of the Australian Defence Force and in the interest of our Special Forces soldiers, General Campbell should remain in place, and there should be a bipartisan view about that in the Parliament and within the government. Because the last thing we need now is to be taking out people who are so intricately involved in this process and probably our best place to know how to take the Defence Force forward from here. He certainly has my confidence. He's a good man, General Campbell. I know him well. He's an excellent soldier. He's an excellent leader. Yes, he will have to be held to account if he was found in any way to be complicit in what was demonstrated in the Branton report, just like every defence minister who has served in the period we've been in Afghanistan and all those who sat on the National Security Committee of the Cabinet.
And before we move on to other issues, just in relation to what we began with Chris Moratis, the Attorney General's Department Chief, taking on that job of Special Investigator, I guess your message about not needing to rush, that is also something that's going to be a broader approach, you would imagine, with the Special Investigator, given the complexity of what he's going to have to look at across the board in the fallout of the Brereton report.
Well, Branton spent years looking at this, Kieran. Now, I don't think his work needs to be protracted. I don't believe we can let all Special Forces families hang out for months, if not years, while he progresses his deliberations. People need closure on these things. Of course, any prosecutions which take place would happen after his work. And of course, the standard for prosecutions for the sorts of acts that Linda Reynolds was talking about are very high and much different than the standards we apply more generally to the behaviour of our Special Forces soldiers. So what sort of time frame
do you want this done in then?
Well, obviously it can't happen any more quickly than it's capable of being done in, Kieran. I'm not saying it should be rushed, but gee, there are a lot of Special Forces soldiers out there at the moment who have wives, who have families, and who are maybe having difficulty explaining to their families what they did or didn't do. And so until we have some closure on this front, a lot of people will be unnecessarily dealing with these problems rather than just those who, are under the heaviest cloud of allegations.
On to some other matters. Let's talk about the Labor issues. You've been critical of the Albanese leadership. If he doesn't find some momentum in 2021, is a Plibersek Chalmers ticket an option?
Well, I haven't been critical of Anthony Albanese. I've been critical of the Labor Party's reluctance to get back to its base, to move to the sensible centre, and to start talking more about the things that really matter to families and working families at this time, both pre-COVID, but now particularly post-COVID, if I dare call it a post-COVID period. The priority for Australians is, of course, personal safety and economic security. It's about jobs, jobs and jobs, and that's where our focus absolutely has to be.
You say you're not critical of Albanese, but he is the leader of the party that's failing to do exactly, in your mind, what you're saying. So I'm sure he'd feel like he's copped a bit of flack, and courtesy of your resignation as well, which was not that helpful a few weeks from the end of the year.
Well, being leader is a tough job, Kieran. Every person who takes it on goes in eyes wide open. They understand that. But my job, in my view, is to continue to progress the policies that I believe are best placed to win us the next election, not for the sake of winning an election, but for the sake of forming a government and delivering for the millions of Australians who rely upon the Labor Party to secure the government benches from time to time. You can have the best policies in the world, Kieran, but they're not much good. They're not much good if they stay in the top drawer after the election.
Let's also be upfront, though, because you told my colleague Andrew Clennell in the interview with Sky that he was struggling. He said it flat out. He's struggling. So if he continues to struggle in your mind heading into 2021, is Plibersek Chalmers a good option?
Kieran, I'm far more interested in what we're saying than I am who's saying it.
So if things don't get better, in your mind, is it fair to say you're not ruling out a leadership challenge yourself?
The caucus is master of its own destiny, Kieran, but I'd much rather Anthony Albanese take us to the elections with the right policies, those capable of winning government and those which put the Labor back in the Labor Party, than switching to someone else and relying upon them to do just that. I believe Anthony Albanese has it in him, and I hope he leads us to the next election.
So quite clearly, you did not rule that out, so it's an option.
Nice try, Kieran.
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear. And
well, I think I've
mentioned on the Plibersek.
Well, I think,
but the Plibersek Chalmers option as well. I've asked you a couple of times. I'll say one more time.
No, because I'm not prepared to talk about other options at a time when I think Anthony Albanese still deserves the opportunity, the chance to get us back to that sensible centre, to put the Labor back in the Labor Party, to talk more about our base, to talk more about our aspiration. I think there's plenty of time for him to do so before the next election. And on that basis, rather than going back to the revolving door, I hope he leads us to the next election.
Would the New South Wales Right, of which you're a senior member, convener up until recently, would you accept a leadership of Tanya Plibersek if that were to unfold?
Kieran, you can ask it 1,000 different ways if you like, but I'm not going to say any more on that matter than I've said. I think I've made my position pretty clear.
On climate change, the Prime Minister was excluded from the climate talks overnight. Now, even Brazil has committed to net zero by 2050. How should the Morrison government be responding to this, given the pressure that they're facing internationally now?
Well, Scott Morrison has embarrassed us internationally, and it did not need be. All he had to say is that Australia commits to net zero emissions by 2050. It's not that hard, Kieran. I mean, he's basically said that's his aspiration anyway, but you know why he won't say it, Kieran? Because that's his personality. You know, he just can't bring himself to back down, to admit he was wrong and to correct his error. It's not that difficult, Prime Minister. Just say it. Net zero emissions by 2050. You don't have to make any immediate changes to your policy direction, although that would be nice because I believe we could afford to be more ambitious, but just make the pledge, Prime Minister. You are increasingly isolated.
It is interesting, given that it's not a binding treaty. It is simply, as you put it, a pledge in that scenario. So in the immediate, even medium term, there is no possible cost on that front. There could be, though. Do you recognise there is an economic cost potentially if this position remains, say, for example, with the UK free trade agreement or the EU free trade agreement, of which the government wants to establish, obviously they will want some climate changes, excuse the pun, from Australia if they are going to sign a free trade agreement, both those parties, the United Kingdom and the EU. So there could be tangible economic flow-ons here.
Look, Kieran, I do see a bit of hypocrisy in the position of some of the Europeans, given there's, so awash with nuclear energy, by example. They don't seem to give recognition of our fossil fuel base here in Australia so important to our economy, but it is entirely possible that the Europeans would start punishing Australia for not making the commitments that seem to align with what the commitment that Malcolm Turnbull made in Paris. So, Scott Morrison needs to do the simple thing. His backbench is now calling upon him to do so. Make the commitment to net zero emissions and then demonstrate to us how he intends to achieve it.
China did reaffirm its commitment to make changes on that front. This is on another front, though, the China-Australia relationship, very rocky as we conclude this weird year that we've had. How would you like to see the government reboot that relationship, or do you think that inevitably it just will simply cool down over a couple of years?
The first step to correcting a mistake, Kieran, is to admit you've made one. Something Scott Morrison and his ministers have been unprepared to do. It must be very obvious to every punter in Australia now that they've mismanaged this relationship. Why did they do this? Because they saw political opportunity here at home in tapping into a rising insecurity amongst Australians about the rise of China. We should never attempt, Rule 101 in foreign relations, we should never attempt to harness votes here at home at the expense of our international relationships, particularly the relationship with our largest trading partner, the country that takes some 30% of our exports. Now, people are now losing their jobs. We're losing our markets. Companies are losing their profits. Farmers are going backwards because Scott Morrison isn't prepared to first admit he made a mistake and then second, of course, do something about it. Now, there's a whole big group of people down in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've got a number of former ambassadors to Beijing, people like Jeff Raby, who have some helpful and strong views and could offer good advice on this question. We've got a whole host of business leaders who have spent decades working in China. I think Scott Morrison could, after admitting his mistake, reach out to them and seek some advice and guidance on how he should go about repairing the damage he's done to this relationship.
Live from the New South Wales Hunt, thanks, Shadow. Former Defence Minister, Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon, appreciate it.